Hi everyone! Today we went to the Staffordshire Regiment Museum to explore the First World War through the lens of the Staffordshire Regiment. So for the viewers at home, would you mind introducing yourself for the viewers?
Hello, my name's Peter Collins and I'm Museum Director of the Staffordshire Regiment Museum. Welcome to our fine museum, and today I'm looking forward to going around our trench system with the Ducky Detectives.
So, I understand this is named after a specific. This trench system is named after a specific individual of the Staffordshire Regiment, Private Coltman, who was a conscientious objector, by what I gathered on the signs further back. Now, granted, conscientious objectors are perhaps a bit less controversial to talk about than they used to be, but why did you choose him as the sort of person to name the trench after, out of all the medal winners of the regiment?
Lance Corporal Coltman, as he became, so originally joined up as a private, was a member of the Primitive Methodist movement. So although he trained as a soldier and went over to fight, he wasn't, because of his religious convictions, was not very keen to hold a weapon when he went over into the battlefield. So in terms of him being sort of a conscientious objector, he's not in that traditional sense. He went over and did his duty, but his talents could be much better used as a stretcher bearer. So for us, he's a really interesting individual as that, but also he also has the accolade of being the highest decorated soldier of the First World War. So by the time he finished his service in the First World War, Lance Corporal Coltman had won the Victoria Cross. He won Distinguished Conduct Medal and Bar and a Military Medal and Bar, as well as a number of other medals and a few mentioned dispatches. So he's a really interesting soldier for us to use, and he was very much after the war involved in activities commemorating the regiment and the activities within this local area. So he seemed very apt to represent everything the First World War did. He also went over very early into the First World War and served throughout the war as well as a stretcher bearer. So this is really interesting. It also shows, of course, that soldiers were not just there to fight, but also involved in lots of other different activities as well.
So, how did technology evolve over the course of the First World War?
So technology in terms of armaments changed quite dramatically over the course of the First War. Some of those changes had already been in place. Things like the machine guns were already being used. The use of big artillery weapons, of course, had all been established. Even the use of U-boats and the Dreadnought class submarine, Dreadnought class vessels had been used. But over the course of that war, the tactics of how they are used changed quite dramatically. We also have things, of course, during the war, like we are here, next to where poison gas might be sighted. That was used in the First War, not on a very successful level, but certainly was used by both sides to help win their war. We, of course, have things like the development of the tank, which was first used in the Battle of Cambrai, which is quite a significant, though maybe didn't change the war dramatically at that time. Also, of course, development of war in the air. So aircraft very much in infancy at the start of the First World War. First power of flight being the end of 1903. But by the end of the war, we have things like dogfighting, bombing raids, use of reconnaissance, all the things we associate with warfare, all in place by that point.
So, as we're here by the poison gas station, and we can imagine the war changed. They always talk about the war of technology and how it changed, and how we got lots of new weapons, machine guns, poison gas, and the like. And we heard some of the sound effects as we came into the trench. How does the museum try to convey the experience of being in trench warfare for the people who visit?
Very good question. As you viewers would expect, it's quite difficult to illustrate of us being here in the First World War and about empathy with those soldiers, because obviously we were not there and we were not in the situation, but we try and convey some of the atmosphere of it through use of sound here and sound systems. So we have noises and sound imagery that goes off. We also have within our trench small dioramas to show people what life was like within the trenches. But some of the bits, particularly smell and feel and touch, we cannot convey quite so well as we would like. In terms of evolution of technology, we do try and show how the trench systems change over the course of that war. So we give them some sense of the change, but it's quite difficult, as you would imagine, to get the feel exactly how. And of course, these were people living over 100 years ago now, so our experience would always be a little bit different. But particularly that sound imagery makes a big difference. If you're here on a wet, cold day, you can imagine being up on the lines, and it'll be quite a challenge for you, I can imagine.
So, when it comes to the material culture and daily life for a Staffordshire soldier in the trenches of the First World War, what kind of things was it like, and how does the museum recreate that?
Good question. So quite often when we focus on the First World War, we think always about the operations, but of course there was actually quite a bit of downtime. So in terms of daily life in the trenches, they would be rebuilding section of the trenches. There would be the times they would be having their tea. There'd be time when they'd be having their stew handouts. There would be the sort of monotony of daily life slightly, which then would obviously be taken over slightly with things like trench raids. They'd be going over and bringing back troops from the enemy side, back in trench for interrogation. There would be the check-in supply lines. They'd be sending down, so quite a bit of what we felt was monotony rather than actually going over on the actual trench line. Rigid structures in place, obviously, to enforce discipline. We're inside here in our officer's dugout, where the officer would be in control, sending letters back, communication, of course, coming up the lines. But we often think again of them being here all the time. They, of course, were up at the lines for similar time, 3 or 4 days at most, and then back down the supply chain afterwards. So quite a bit of monotony, really, in terms of daily life, but obviously punctured by high energy, in terms of the obviously going over the top for when they were part of big operations like pushes, the battles, Somme, Ypres, whatever, but also in terms of the raidings that were going on to bring information back and that sort of thing. So yeah, we would find it sometimes probably quite a struggle sometimes actually coping life. In between that, of course, as we might hear in the video, there's lots of noise going around, so there's a constant source of noise of weapons and bombs and all those sort of things going off all the time.
So, when it comes to the other side effects of war, not just the physical wounding, but issues of psychological health, what how does the museum capture the feel of being in the trench in terms of like the mind that goes through, and how did soldiers cope with trench life?
Very good question. I think we find quite often the problem with soldiers coming over and those bits, as you say, outside of physical injuries are not always recorded. And of course, at this time period, there's other effects like being injured, as we can see here, but also with the effects, obviously, of that trauma, that mental anguish things. They're very much being understood at this time period. So very much we find, as you get towards the end of the war, there's documentation that's been recorded, but there isn't a vast amount. It's really when we get into later conflicts that we find that information comes out there. There has been some great work, some wonderful work by historians such as Lynn MacDonald, and those who documented some of those aspects, and of course the idea of shell shock, and those all became well known over the course of the First World War. But yeah, very much it's difficult for us to convey to the public that story, but we hope when we do it through our interpretation panels, when we do recreations here, that it gives them a sense of that, not just the injuries that the soldiers suffer, but also that mental anguish, as you correctly say.
So given here we are by the French chateau, as it's known, here in the no man's land section, But in a way it wasn't really no man's land, because there were people who were living here and other cultures such as the French and the Belgians that perhaps some of the men of the Staffordshires would have seen for the first time, and obviously being with different empire and all the people that, you know, when World War I started, the great powers brought their empires with them. Do we know how the kind of experience of, say, what we might call nowadays culture shock, how that worked with the men, and the conveying of what it was like to be in a different part of the world to where you're used to, and how that was conveyed?
Good question. So it's when we go over to the again, looking through our records and archives, it's certainly the first time that people get to go abroad, sometimes even leaving their own towns and villages in the First World War. So they've been in their small little village, small little town in Staffordshire, and suddenly they're experiencing a different culture, a different way of life. As we all know, yeah, quite often there was lots of destruction, as we're in an area here of no man's land, so there was many towns and villages were obliterated in on the Belgian, Franco-Belgian border and things. But also, of course, they got to experience and talk to people they never talked to before. Unfortunately, again, a massive amount that isn't documented, but they would have been there in the cafes, buying things from the shops and things as they came down from the lines. Certainly, I think a lot of the locals welcomed them in. Obviously, they were spending their money, but also they were helping them, you know, in their perceived cause and their cause for liberty. So we generally find it was quite good relations. Sometimes things obviously went away. They, in certain cases, things were stolen and lifted and things like that. But generally, it seems to be a good experience by troop. We don't find after the war really much experience in our archives talking about how it changed people in that way of the cultural experience. But you can certainly gather, by the end of the war, particularly with those technological developments we covered earlier, the world had become smaller. So, you know, the thought of taking a trip over to Northern Europe wasn't as scary as it was maybe pre-1914. Of course, the world had changed. You know, if we think of back to the 100 years pre to the start of the First World War, back to the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, many people didn't travel hardly at all at that time. So the Victorians and the Edwardians were a little bit different, and they had a number of them, particularly the upper and middle classes, had experienced life on the continent. But yeah, it was certainly very much changed from how they experienced life before.
Oh, and just another thing to clarify, because Britain had a very big empire that it brought into the war with them. Do we happen to know much about how the Staffords felt or meshed with empire, with troops from the Empire, the Commonwealth, or even other parts of Britain?
Good question. We certainly know they obviously worked in with different, particularly from the Indian National Army, who had a lot of troops on the Western Front in the First World War. Obviously, the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders, particularly in Gallipoli. So yeah, we do know that they work well together. I think they certainly seem to muddle along together. There'll be cultural changes within them, but they, as troops, I think they're all facing certain situations together. So we tend to find that they just seem to treat them all as their own brethren and their own source of protection at that time. So certainly, I think at that time we treated everybody as one. Obviously, there was elements of, I suspect, although we don't see it much in the records of racial and sort of superiority questions, but so quite a bit of digging we need to be done in the archives to get that sort of information come across. But it'd be fascinating to see.
So, as we're here towards the end of the trench exhibit, we find a recreation of a German trench. But as this is the Staffordshire Regiment Museum, why is there a reconstruction of a German trench in this part?
Good question. So we want to show, obviously, both sides of conflict. So it's really important to tell we have a no man's land bit in between, so it's useful for us to explain it. Also, what this allows us to do is to focus on the reinforced lines that happen beyond the German front lines, where they enforced and brought in the Hindenburg line, which brought a level of fortifications which were very strong, and were actually the Staffords are part of the group that division that broke the lines in September 1918, which certainly hastened towards the end of the war where the armistice that came in November 1918. So really important for us to be able to illustrate that with this trench section. Also, of course, you can see some of the developments again technologically that happened, of course, the war in terms of fortifications, which actually link back in a lot to how fortifications have been around for centuries. In terms of castle structures and how we fight. So they're quite an intriguing little collection for us to have.
Hi, I'm here today to present my latest paperback edition of Mud, Blood and Determination. An awful lot of the work that went into it was done here and remembers the work and heroism of the Staffords.
And we at the museum are really keen to have a copy of this book to help to the narrative of what our troops got up to in the First World War.
Thank you, Peter, for letting us join you today. And thank you very much for your time and support with our questions, and hope that this helps the viewers understand the First World War a little bit better. And so thank you to everyone for watching, and it was lovely having you here.